Call me Duke Thorin and watch as I tell you about the magnificence of the contests on Alpha Draft. No need to pray for good fortune this Christmas, as you could save your Christmas from being one without Skrilla by seeing how much you can win playing Fantasy LOL. There's no limit to the amount of money you could reach if your skills are pure enough. Reach for your credit card and play today if you should so choose. I know I'll be going to Alpha Draft to play in the LCS contests for the upcoming EU LCS in a few weeks. That's the end of that segment. I got paid to say that. So there's a story has come out and a response to it where a company or an organization called the Korea Creative Content Agency, KCCA as an acronym, published a report where they explained, or rather stated, what the average salary for a Korean pro gamer is. Now, it's worth saying, when this was reported, and they also reported as another part of the headline, that over 62% of Korean pro gamers had intentions or aspirations to move overseas, presumably to make more money. And they did a study, which is where they concluded that those two pieces of information. So the average yearly salary they stated was $21,000, 138. So not very much money. Below the average salary of someone in Korea who's a working professional. Now, first and foremost, in their actual study article explaining the findings, it did say that this was KeSPA registered pro gamers. And you have to realize that doesn't just mean League of Legends. That also means StarCraft 2. That means Sudden Attack. In the past, it's meant games like Kart Rider. I'm not sure how many games they currently have at the moment. And so there are a number of games that aren't League of Legends. So the problem with that is people hear that statement, pro gamer makes 21,000. They're going to think, right, all Korean League of Legends pros make 21,000. No, not the case. So bear that in mind as we consider this. Now, when they did this study, what's funny is in the study itself, it's KeSPA that said it was the KCCA, but actually the study itself says Korea Creative Industry Research Institute, which is KCIRI. And it said it involved 51 KeSPA pro gamers over a period of 2 months, starting in July, so in the middle of when everyone was contracted. And that was discovered that the average salaries of esports players in Korea is $21,138, and that the majority of pro gamers were dissatisfied with the figure. So when they did the breakdown for the satisfaction with the salary, people could say which one they wanted. Was it normal? Are they slightly dissatisfied? Are they very dissatisfied? Believe it or not, over 74% actually didn't seem that dissatisfied. As in, 43% said just normal, 31% said slightly dissatisfied. So actually, here's an alarming thing as we go forward to this discussion, is that even though most pros aren't earning very much money, they weren't particularly dissatisfied. The majority of them seem to think it's fine or just mildly dissatisfied. But if they actually knew some of the value of other players and what people make in other regions, I suspect that would be different. Now, 68% said they wanted to move overseas, had a desire, but that's also not, believe it or not, when they broke down the reasons, that wasn't purely just because of salary. Some of them was to develop their career. Some of them really thought like new experiences, stuff like that. Now, what's interesting is that, just as a final point as well, within the same actual study, they also asked the people what their concerns were over their career length. And unsurprisingly, in Korea, especially where you have to have got a good job in theory in your 20s, a lot of them were concerned that beyond the age of 25, you have to have a really good job in place. And this is the issue here, because if this kind of salary, 21,000, is being earned by people who are 25, they're already well into the phase where you've started your career or gotten the education that will lead to your career. And so that's a concern. Because it said here, the most drastic difference was in the salary for players over the age of 25, accumulating to a yearly salary of $6,788 compared to the $25,985 salary of players aged 20 to 25. Now, once this came out, obviously, like I mentioned, a lot of people assumed it was League of Legends players entirely, and there was a furore about it. It was on Reddit. People were like, "Wow, these players are getting paid way too little," because we've all heard the stories of some of the big name Koreans going to China and making $500,000 a year, making $600,000 a year. Supposedly, there was an offer of $1 million for Flame, my favorite player, formerly CJ Enters Blaze top laner, who actually went to LGD for less money because he thought it was a more competitive team to play for. So KeSPA, the Korean Esports Association, who run esports as the governing body, unsurprisingly came out and made a response to this. And their response was pretty much to try and poo-poo, try and eschew a lot of this information and say this isn't correct, like the data isn't good here, and here's what we say is the story. Because obviously you have to understand, they know this makes Korean esports look bad and like they're underpaying the players, some of the best players in the world in esports. Here's the problem. KeSPA's statement came out and it said that their headline said, KeSPA responds to KCCA pro gamer salary data, 10 players over $85,000, $241,000 a year salary. So KeSPA has released their statement after a self-investigation, blah, 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 skip forwards. According to KeSPA data, the average salary for League of Legends players is $57,000. StarCraft players make $39,000. Over 10 players receive a salary of over $85,000. And the association also reminded the public that profits from streaming activities will only increase the amount players receive. Well, I mean, obviously, that's irrelevant to how much they make in salary, though. Now then, here's what's interesting, is that, first of all, they add this in here. They said that the report in question had combined a few League of Legends players and StarCraft 2 Pro players with players from multiple other categories, games, that are comparatively more difficult to receive official salaries. On top of that, here's an interesting point. On top of that, the report in question and the following media coverage has blown into an inappropriate controversy in both domestic and foreign communities about the treatment of Korean professional esports players, which is why we are releasing the following official data. Now, here's what's interesting. They're saying there that the way it was handled was reported has led to this inappropriate controversy. But here's where it gets interesting, because their report contains data only from 40 players from 8 KeSPA registered corporation professional teams that have finalized their official contracts as of now. So here's the point to make there. As of now. Now remember, that study before went back to July of this year and took a 2-month span. They're saying we're only going to do 40 players, not a large sample size themselves, certainly not what's possible in the entire industry, and they're going to use the excuse that because these are the only players currently signed to contracts, that's why they can only use that. Yeah, that's a terrible idea. The better would be to do it during last year, during a period when everyone was signed, and then take do the average of that and the median and figure out how many people make over a certain amount. Instead, they've purposely used this one to limit the numbers so that they can fuck a little bit with the numbers. So as of December 2015, the only League of Legends teams they've included are KT, Samsung, SKT, CJ, Jin Air, Najin, Longzhu, which is IM, Tigers. And they have 25 players from 5 StarCraft 2 teams. And the 5 StarCraft 2 teams are KT, Samsung, SKT, CJ, Jin Air. Now, it said that, obviously the published data excludes the streaming income, performance bonuses, incentives, and prize money. Well, that's obvious, because again, we're not talking about those. It's actually irrelevant what those are as to whether the base salary is respectable. The fact they keep mentioning that seems a bit disingenuous. It's almost suggesting that should be counted as part of someone's salary. It shouldn't. Those are other activities for which you are paid money. Now then, it says the actual average salary for League of Legends is 57,000. But remember, that's only covering 40 players. And 39,000 for StarCraft 2, and that is only covering 25 players. It said and then there are 10 players who make the 85,000. So, okay, here's what's interesting. Immediately, there's fuckery going on here by KeSPA, because they make the point about surveying everyone in the other post, using the maximum data set, and yet they then themselves omit teams. Now, they use the excuse that we're doing it right now. Why would you do it right now? We're talking about last year, so why not show us last year's stats? Why show us this year's? Because since we know some teams haven't signed yet, especially some of the lesser ones, that's going to skew the number. It's like your purpose. This is what disingenuously, I don't know, the plural of that is. That's what being disingenuous is about. You're trying to present something one way, knowing it will be taken differently than the reality of the situation by just twisting the way it is a little bit, or omitting one slight detail and emphasizing another, so that the other person will take a different perspective on it than what you know to be the actual case. So here's some of the fuckery. They excluded some teams. So for example, in League of Legends, you'll notice in that list, they didn't have Spenu, they didn't have Anarchy. These are 2 teams who should be among some of the lowest salaries, particularly Anarchy, because these were bottom feeder teams, these were brand new teams, and these were teams without good sponsors. StarCraft 2, they purposely omitted Svenu and MVP from the average salary figure. Now, what's funny is Svenu and MVP are both KeSPA teams. But because they picked this very specific reason, they created a problem themselves. Well, these teams are the only ones signed right now, so we can only use these. They conveniently were able to cut out some of the bottom part of what the overall amount would be that would have drawn the average down. How convenient of KeSPA. Now, for League of Legends, they only included 40 players representing 8 teams. That also excludes trainees, substitutes, and basically anyone except a starter. Practice partners, people who used to live in the house, Hooney, etc. for Samsung last 2 years ago. These people didn't get selected. The idea that you can only take 25 players from 5 StarCraft 2 teams is ridiculous, but there's way more players than that because you think about how many people play in Pro League. Now, here's another interesting thing. They listed Najin players' salaries as part of it. Who are these Najin players? We don't know any of these people. We don't know that Najin has a team. Najin's supposed to be dead. So who are these? Where are these salaries that are included in this? Again, mysterious information, but we need to know it for context. It's also worth stating that when they said there are 10 players who make more than $85,000, you'll notice they didn't tell us how much those players made. That's very important to know. Because if they're giving us numbers and details to try and give us an accurate picture, then we need to know, does more than 85,000 mean most of them make 86,000? Or are there a couple, as I suspect with Faker, for example, who might make 200,000? Because if he makes 200,000 or 300,000, he's going to skew the number up again. Because remember, it's only 40 people. And so if he's making 300,000, he will skew it, even though he's one person, by quite a bit, because he's making so much more than even their average that they said, which was 85,000. And so in this scenario, if they wanted to be entirely transparent and really give a good sense of how much was made in the scene, they wouldn't give you the average. Because again, that would be skewed by people who made a lot and then other people all making around the middle area. Instead, what they should do is give you the median value. So that's the middle value. So say there's 40, I might sound like an idiot now, but I'll be like number 20 or 21 within the list is who you tell us how much does that person make. Because if we find out that person's making 40,000, well, let's make it a more realistic number, 60,000. So, well, it's already 60 anyway, 50,000. Then we'll know that the ones above 100,000 skewed it massively. That's very important to know because it's already been said on the OGN True LoL show that some of the Coup Tigers players make over 100,000. Remember, there's 10 players make over 100,000. We must know that it's almost certain Faker does. Presumably, some of the other SKT players might make more as well. Average salary, when I looked up on Wikipedia, for Korea and USA, average salary for the USA is $56,000 a year. So actually, the average they're quoting would be more than the average salary for a man in the USA. But, like I was saying, it's almost certain that the average, that most players, for example, okay, even the middle players, the medium players are not making 68,000. Meanwhile, the average salary for Koreans is only 36,000 a year. So, okay, most people, if we could assume it wasn't fuckery, would be making more than the average salary. So that would be good, right? But that's why we need the context to really know what these numbers mean in exchange for each other. That's why there's that famous saying that you can, if you torture the numbers enough, like choose selectively which ones to show and how to present them, you can make them say anything. Now, part of the problem in Korea, in terms of low salaries, is quite simple. It goes like this. The problem in Korea is that the ecosystem has so much untapped potential in the amateur and semi-pro scene that it means that the top pros practically always look to solo queue when they want to recruit replacement talent or subs and people to work on and develop. Now, even when that doesn't work, people, because they have so much talent out there and so many times it does work, they will just gamble again. They won't go, right, this didn't work this one time. So, for example, in the past, there have been certain players who came from solo queue. People thought, oh, this guy's going to do a lot. He didn't. They just start again. Typically, it has worked in most cases because there is so much talent. But even when it didn't work recruit this method, you could always just source talent from the lower OGN teams. So famously, Zenix. People like Swift, people like Coco came to CJ from Zenix. People like Daydream, people like Emperor, they all came over from these lower level teams. Now, this core principle is why salaries didn't rise in the past. It's nothing to do with results or results elsewhere or how China was doing. Because here's the key thing. If a player wanted to leave your team, you could almost be certain you could get someone just a little bit worse who had the potential to develop, someone just as good, or in fact, sometimes by gambling, you'd end up with someone even better. That could also happen for the same exact money that you were willing to pay the player who's left and said it's not enough money. because this guy's just an amateur player now. He's just a semi-pro. So that salary to him will be great and he'll take it immediately. As a result, there is no market pressure. Doesn't matter how well people perform, unless they have a big fan base and you want to somehow leverage that going forwards, like some of the CJ players, you can just let these guys go. You can let them go to China, whatever. You can sign someone out of solo queue, spend the same kind of budget, and potentially have the same success again. That really can happen. That's why the salaries didn't rise. There's also the factor that burnout is an issue for Korean pros. They practice so much that unfortunately they don't have careers like NBA players. In the NBA, where you're going to play 10, maybe 15 years, you have these periods in time where it's going to take a few years to develop. Then at that point, you're going to be at the end of your first crappy contract. Now you can, by showing off your skills, which you've developed, you can now get a better contract. Then after that one, if you're really good, you're going to get your best contract. You're going to get the star player contract. You're going to have years that you're going to be coming up to, okay, 2 years from now, okay, on this year's my career year. That's when most players go ham and try their hardest and do everything because they want to earn the bigger contract after that. In Korean League of Legends, most top players don't remain on top for more than about a year. There are a few exceptions who remained for 2 years. Obviously, some of the players leaving to China allowed some of them also to extend how long they were on top, that they might have dropped off in terms of relative competition if all of the players who went to China had remained. So as a result, after you've had a year of this player, it's also probably not worth you raising his salary much because he's probably going to drop off now. If you've had him 2 years, he's almost certainly going to be burned out. Level's almost certainly going to go down. It doesn't matter even if you're a god, like someone like a Mad Life, like someone like Shy. Eventually they drop off. It's very rare players like Faker who can really stay around that long at the top, and they are exceptions to the rule. There's also the factor that you even see this in terms of success. There's a reason why, until the two SK Telecom teams, no team had ever repeated in history. Only SK Telecom 2013 and SK Telecom 2015 have repeated as OGN champions. Every other team has won the OGN title, been the best team, potentially the best team in the world, and history tells us, just as it always happened before, after that, they are most likely not only going to drop off, but they will not win the next title, and they individually as players will start to fade away, and the team will start to fade away, and maybe some of them can remain good. Finally, there's the factor that most of these young guys at some point are going to have to go to the army. So some of them you're only going to have for a few years, and some of them, if their career doesn't go well, might just choose to go after a couple of years. So the investment's different, and you know they're going to disappear eventually anyway. It's not like you're losing all these people and they're going to play for 10 years, and if you lose this guy after 1 year, he's going to play 9 more years for your rival team. That's not going to happen in general. Now, what's funny is, back in the days of Brood War, StarCraft Brood War, so we're talking about the 2000s basically, there was very big money for top players. Now, yes, top players, obviously, even though they're on teams, you can just pay that one guy and a massive amount of money. You're not having to pay 5 guys in the same way. You would pay your whole team, but you'd pay them based on how good they were and how they negotiated their contracts. Some of these guys made a lot of money. There were top star players who made hundreds of thousands of dollars. Like, actually, someone found an old listing where the players I Love Uv and... let me think who else they had there at the time. I think Kingdom was one of them. These sorts of players made like $450,000 a year, $300,000 a year. I know in the latter days, players like Flash, Jaedong, Bisu were making $200,000 to $300,000 a year salary. Really massive amounts of money. What the top League of Legends pros you'd hope at this point in time should be making. But they're not, as we've seen by those figures, even by KeSPA. Even KeSPA's fuckery can't get the number even vaguely close for star players to that. Some of them making over $100,000. Okay, great. So there's clearly an issue overall going on here in the Korean scene. It hasn't been fixed. Now, I will say I have some compassion, I have some sympathy for the Korean teams because they can't compete with the best Chinese teams because, as we know, some of that money is not market value. It's market value in the sense that someone's willing to pay that, but it's not in any way based on anything organic. It's not based on any kind of ecosystem. It's rich sons of billionaires and super rich businessmen who've just come in and they want to play God and they just want to buy up the best players that they decide for their team for untold amounts of money, essentially writing them a blank check, making them an offer they can't refuse. And as a result, as a business with sponsors, you can't compete with that. And sometimes it would be wrong, actually. Like, for example, if you know how much Mata makes and people say, 500, 600,000 a year, it actually isn't worth it for someone like Samsung to get, even if they could get that money together, to get the money together to keep him. Like, actually, that money, that would be massively overpaying you. And that's now you should let him go. The difference is, we want to know, are they paying reasonable amounts to people who are there? Like, for example, does someone like Gorilla, we would assume not because he plays for one of the lesser teams without sponsors right now, does he make $100,000 a year? Maybe he did because they said Ku made over 100,000, but he was potentially the player of the year. He was the best support player in the world last year. He should be making a massive amount of money, the highest salaries in Korea. Does he? We don't know because we don't have the information still, thanks to KeSPA. So I think this is an issue in terms of the Korean salaries. Just as an issue in the ecosystem, they're not paid enough still. There's too many people at the bottom of that who almost certainly are making very low amounts of money. In the StarCraft 2 scene, I understand more because they've lost their television show. It's not on OSL anymore, on GameNet anymore. They don't have the big reach. StarCraft 2's essentially died out, and it was never really very alive in Korea anyway. It was living off the Brood War hype for a couple of years. Now you're in a position where for League of Legends, though, it's supposed to be the biggest game in the world, esports-wise. It's supposed to be one of the most watched, especially in Korea. There's supposed to be organizations who have big sponsors. They should be paying their players more, and we're told that until Riot came in and bumped some of it up, they weren't even paying them that much last year. So God only knows back then how much they were playing. So it'd be nice to see some transparency, especially when at the moment KeSPA is using the lack of transparency to fuck with your perception and is trying to mess with the numbers a little bit here. So it's a little bit disingenuous, I think. Anyway, thanks to Alpha Draft for paying me good money.